We are reading Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation. And today it is Chapter 8. In the first half of the 20th century, a more secular humanist form of feminism dominated the landscape. There were certainly still many occult feminists, but excitement about technological developments created a move away from traditional religion toward an evolutionary secular scientism in the public consciousness of the West. This began to create a bit of tension between two types of feminism. In the occult sphere, the famous English occultist Aleister Crowley had started his own new religion, Thelema. A central figure in Thelema is Babylon, a Crowleyan spelling of Babylon. It's Babalon. Also known as the Scarlet Woman. In her god form, she is a sacred whore. Thelema draws heavily on teachings of the Golden Dawn, of which Crowley was a member before leaving to formulate his own spiritualism. The figure of Babylon harkens back to the ancient temple prostitutes, and in Thelema she represents the liberated woman and the female sexual impulse. Crowley believed that Babylon must be incarnated to help usher in the new age of Horus, an age of radical individual will which would replace the patriarchal age of Osiris that had dominated mankind since the Middle Ages. The Scarlet Woman would be this physical manifestation. Crowley believed himself to be the beast on which the Scarlet Woman would ride, ushering in this new age. He perceived many of the women in his life to be potential vessels for Babylon and engaged in intense, complicated sex magic rituals with them, hoping to incarnate Babylon. You can already see how this would be incredibly appealing to radical feminists of the time. He referred to Revelation 17 to explain this belief, which says, "The angel carried my spirit away to the desert. I saw the scarlet woman sitting on the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, covered with blasphemous names. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and gilded with gold and precious stones and pearls, with a golden cup in her hand, filled with the abominations and the unclean things of her fornication. On her forehead a name had been written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, and of the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman was drunk from the blood of the saints and from the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. Seeing her, I wondered greatly." This is another example of occult belief in Luciferian forces being the great liberator of humanity, especially women. 2 of Crowley's followers and students, Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, set out to perform a series of sex magic rituals based on Crowley's teachings called the Babylon Working, which were intended to incarnate Babylon and usher in the new age. Jack Parsons was a rocket engineer and the main founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a federally funded NASA Center for Research and Development. In 1946, shortly after beginning the Babylon Working, Parsons met a woman named Marjorie Cameron. He immediately believed her to be the Scarlet Woman. I first heard about Cameron through a video by author Jay Dyer, and I knew she must be included in this book, which was halfway finished at the time. Cameron perfectly represents to me the epitome of the feminist spirit of the 20th century, not only because of her entanglements with such famous occultists, but because she is a hero to feminists, and she personifies the occult feminist spirit perfectly. It is no wonder to me at all that Parsons felt the same way about her. Cameron, as she preferred to be called, was an attractive, charismatic woman with flaming red hair. Cameron and Parsons were immediately attracted to each other, and the relationship was sexual from the very beginning. After only a few weeks together, Cameron discovered she was pregnant, but had an abortion without telling Parsons. At that point, he hadn't told her that it was his intention to told her that it was his intention to try to bring forth a child with her who would be an antichrist. This was not Cameron's first abortion. In her teens, she had been promiscuous and become pregnant, which her mother remedied by performing an illegal at-home abortion. Cameron had despised religion all her life, but when Jack Parsons introduced her to Thelema, she gradually became more curious and interested in the occult. She first began reading about astral projection and using tarot cards. The couple married the same year they met, but both were volatile personalities and the relationship was turbulent. They remained together, but had affairs. Both were into the Hollywood bohemian and beatnik scenes and had parties which were attended by other radicals of the time. In 1952, Jack Parsons was working on a project for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and accidentally blew himself up while working with explosives in his home. Cameron was devastated and retreated to an artist commune in Mexico. There, she performed occult blood rituals, cutting her own wrists in hopes of contacting the spirit of her dead husband. After a couple of months in Mexico, she returned to California and attempted suicide. When the attempt failed, she began studying Thelema in an attempt to feel closer to Jack and give her life some sense of direction. She became convinced, as was Parsons, that the spirit of Babylon had been incarnated into her. Late in 1952, Cameron moved to a broken-down ranch in California and began to assemble her own sex magic cult, which she called The Children. She intentionally gathered occultists of different races and oversaw sex magic rituals and orgies, which were intended to bring about mixed-race moon children who would be incarnated through these spells. Cameron used a number of hallucinogenic drugs during these rituals, something that is quite common in occult ritual magic. Cameron became increasingly obsessed with apocalyptic visions of race war, aliens, and the end of the world, and she began to write letters to Jane Wolfe, a fellow Thelemite magic practitioner. Wolfe had been a friend of Crowley and was the master of the Ordo Templis Orientis Lodge in Agape, California. Cameron also became a fixture of the occult scene in Hollywood, starring in B-movies made by fellow Thelemite Kenneth Anger, and hanging out with famous people like Dennis Hopper, Anton LaVey, and Dean Stockwell. By this time, Cameron had become a counterculture icon and well-known witch. She was still producing art which blended feminist liberation and occultic themes. Her art has become even more popular since her death, and Cameron has become the stuff of legend for many feminists, especially in recent years with the revival of witchcraft in the United States. Here is some of Cameron's art. On the opposite side of the pendulum from Marjorie Cameron and the rebellious occult practitioners of the mid-20th century were secular atheist intellectuals such as Simone de Beauvoir. Born in France in 1908, de Beauvoir was an existentialist philosopher whose writing laid the groundwork for second-wave feminism. Since she is such an intellectual, she is not often thought of as a radical, but many of her ideas were foundational to radical feminism. Her most famous book, The Second Sex, was the first to position the female identity as other in relation to male identity. She shared the same view as others who came before her about religion, specifically Christianity, that it was at the root of women's oppression. Like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Simone de Beauvoir believed that men not only controlled religion, but that they used it to control women. She saw Christianity as a patriarchal fantasy which most women were not educated enough to dismiss. She also was among the first to describe the gender-sex distinction which defines transgender ideology today. In The Second Sex, she says, "One is not born, but becomes a woman." Like Margaret Sanger, she had an incredibly negative view of motherhood and did not believe in the concept of any innate maternal instinct. Thus, she never had any children. She also advocated for a Marxist socialist communal system of raising children due to her ideas about women liberating themselves by transcending their status as wife and mother. She did not believe women's liberation was possible if women raised their children in a nuclear family setting, as she illustrates in this now famous quote from Sex, Society, and the Female Dilemma in the Saturday Review, June 14, 1975. "As long as the family and the myth of the family and the myth of maternity and the maternal instinct are not destroyed, women will still be oppressed. No woman should be authorized to stay at home and raise her children. Society should be totally different. Women should not have that choice, precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will make that one." In addition, de Beauvoir thought that marriage was destructive to both partners, but particularly to women, and she never married but had several partners. De Beauvoir believed that pansexuality was ideal as it provided maximum freedom, and that both heterosexuality and homosexuality were equally restrictive. She had several controversial affairs with women, including one with a young student of hers, French author Bianca Lamblin. Lamblin later wrote of the relationship in her book, A Disgraceful Affair, where she describes being taken advantage of by the much older de Beauvoir and seduced into a sexual relationship with both de Beauvoir and her longtime male partner, Jean-Paul Sartre. De Beauvoir was also fired from a teaching job and had her teaching license revoked for seducing a 17-year-old student. It is speculated that she had other relationships with much younger female students as well. De Beauvoir became more directly involved in feminist causes in the 1970s. She wrote and signed a document called Manifesto 343, a declaration signed by 343 women who claimed to have had abortions while they were still illegal under French law. It is credited with starting the effort to legalize abortion in France. Another radical feminist of this period was Betty Friedan, an American secular Jew whose book The Feminine Mystique is credited with officially kicking off the more radical second wave of feminism. Like many feminists of the 20th century, Friedan was a graduate of Smith College, one of the first women's colleges in the United States, which has produced many iconic figures of the feminist movement. The Feminine Mystique was a manifesto against the domesticity of the 1950s homemaker, which was inspired mainly by the unhappiness both Friedan and her own mother say they felt about being stay-at-home mothers. I like to call this book Basic Bitch Feminist Theory for the Masses. In contrast to the deep existential philosophy of Simone de Beauvoir, Betty Friedan's work was far more accessible to the average American woman, which is probably why it was so successful. The book popularized the now common trope of the bored, unfulfilled housewife who would inevitably end up having affairs to relieve her restlessness. Friedan was also a Marxist, and she became the first president of NOW, the National Organization for Women. Friedan differed from most other feminists of her era in that she did not care nearly as much about sexual liberation, but more about equal job opportunities and legal independence for women. Radical lesbian separatist movements had just begun to pick up steam within the feminist movement, and Friedan thought that associating with this fringe extremism, as she viewed it, would alienate her target audience, the average housewife. This led to a bit of a civil war between Friedan and some other prominent activists of the time, including the now famous rivalry between her and Gloria Steinem. What would a book on feminism be without at least one good catfight? Gloria Steinem burst onto the scene in 1969 when she covered an abortion speak out for New York Magazine. She was quickly propelled to the front of the movement and began to eclipse Frieden, who had been its unofficial leader for the last 6 years. I think it is a bit naive to think that there was no element of jealousy here regarding Frieden's dislike for Steinem. It's true they had ideological differences, but it's also hard not to notice that the 13 years younger Steinem was a better poster girl for the movement. With her long hair, good looks, and stylish dress, the media was much more drawn to Steinem than the aging, frumpier Frieden. Frieden once criticized Steinem for publicly disparaging men while privately dating some of the most glamorous men in New York. Frieden was also critical of Steinem's support for radical lesbian feminists, saying this would alienate mainstream American women. Steinem rarely addressed Frieden's criticism until it reached a fever pitch, when Frieden joined forces with the feminist group the Red Stockings in publicly accusing Steinem of being a CIA plant hired to sow division within the feminist movement. But Frieden wasn't exactly wrong. Gloria Steinem was born in Toledo in 1934 to Ruth and Leo Steinem. Her paternal grandmother, Pauline Perlmutter Steinem, was a suffragist and feminist activist as well as a theosophist. Gloria's mother, Ruth, was also a theosophist who raised Gloria in the tradition. Steinem attended Smith College, where she was recruited into the Central Intelligence Agency. She was awarded a CIA-created Chester Bowles Fellowship, which has never been awarded to anyone else and doesn't seem to exist except in the particular case of Steinem, leading many to speculate that it was awarded to conceal the source of funding to send her to India for 2 years between 1956 and 1958. This piqued my interest after having read repeatedly about the activities of theosophists in India, knowing that Steinem had personal ties to theosophy. Steinem also says she had an abortion in England on the way to India and dedicated her autobiography, My Life on the Road, to the doctor who performed it. Once she arrived in India, Steinem associated with various radical groups, from Gandhian independence activists to radical communists, presumably spying for the CIA and possibly peddling influence there. She also worked with Jean Joyce of the Ford Foundation during these 2 years. Upon her return from India, she was sent to Europe as part of the National Student Association working under the Congress for Cultural Freedom, a group which claimed to be an advocate for liberal democratic values in post-war Europe and America, but was actually a CIA Cold War propaganda front. Her role was to infiltrate youth festivals and promote progressive publications and possibly collect intelligence. This group was later exposed by Ramparts magazine and the Saturday Evening Post, which reported that the National Student Association was CIA funded. The CCF was renamed and continued with funding from the Ford Foundation, which had supported Steinem while in India. These operations were part of a larger CIA initiative meant to infiltrate and influence the media in the United States and abroad, which was called Operation Mockingbird. The head of this operation, Cord Meyer, is said to be the person who recruited and directed Steinem during her time with the CIA. Steinem's work in journalism and media was directed and funded by the CIA as part of their effort to liberalize Western culture and feminism. Feminism was a big part of this effort. Once again, we see that the accepted narrative of bored housewives in the West rising up in a grassroots effort to break the shackles of domestic slavery is baloney. The feminist revolution of the 60s and 70s was planned, orchestrated, and manipulated. Steinem was not at all the only major figure involved in the CIA's fabrication of the Cultural Revolution. British historian Francis Stoner Saunders wrote in 1999, "Whether they liked it or not, whether they knew it or not, there were few writers, poets, artists, historians, scientists, or critics in post-war Europe whose names were not in some way linked to this covert enterprise." The CCF had over 20 publications in 35 countries around the world at the height of its operation. In 1977, reporter Carl Bernstein wrote an article for Rolling Stone called "The CIA and the Media," which detailed findings by a congressional inquiry called the Church Committee, which found that around 400 journalists were considered assets by the CIA during this time, including Katharine Graham, the owner of the Washington Post. This was a direct violation of the CIA's charter, which stated that it was not supposed to engage in domestic spying. Another magazine set up with CIA funding to influence American culture was Ms. Magazine. It was the first explicitly feminist magazine set up in 1972 by Steinem and her CIA colleague, Clay Felker. Felker had already been promoting Steinem's articles for a few years in magazines like Esquire. You may remember the picture of the first cover of Ms. featuring the bloodthirsty Hindu goddess Kali. Given Steinem's background in theosophy, this cover selection makes a lot more sense. The magazine was very popular and highly influential in the 70s and into the 80s. Steinem was able to lend support and legitimacy to the more radical elements of feminism which emerged in the 70s, like Cell 16, a radical feminist separatist group whose membership included David Rockefeller's daughter, Abby. Radical lesbian feminist groups began to attract media coverage as well in the 1970s, aiming for the abolishment of heterosexuality, motherhood, and the nuclear family as the default norm in society. Such groups saw heteronormativity as a force of political oppression. Steinem defended radical lesbian feminism, while Frieden and her organization Now were considered homophobic by such groups. Frieden continued to move in a secular humanist direction, signing the UN document the Humanist Manifesto II in 1973, which states, "We believe, however, that traditional dogmatic or authoritarian religions that place relevance, God, ritual, or creed above human needs and experience do a disservice to the human species. Any account of nature should pass the tests of scientific evidence. In our judgment, the dogmas and myths of traditional religions do not do so. No deity will save us, we must save ourselves." The document rejects all traditional religion, including any notion of the human soul or any afterlife, but rather affirms evolutionary biology as the sole cause of human existence. It also affirms birth control, divorce, and abortion as human rights. It seeks to establish a purely secular, centrally planned, one-world society with an international court and the total abolition of national borders. This document was very much in line with the goals and aims of the UN and the Rockefeller Foundation. Betty Friedan is listed on the document as a signatory, as well as Julian Huxley and Isaac Asimov. Secular humanism has since continued to gain steam among the technocratic elite of the world as technology and telecommunications have continued to make advancements, but interestingly, the occult roots of feminism have also continued to grow and gain new ground as well. By the 1980s, feminism had entered the mainstream consciousness and feminist ideals and ethics began to be accepted by mainstream Western society. Technological progress is in large part what has enabled a widespread belief that men and women can be seen as interchangeable widgets who are essentially the same. It seems that no matter how technologically advanced we become, human beings are drawn to spiritual dimensions of existence, a belief in some connection with the divine. However, in the modern era, feminism had universally condemned traditional religion, especially Christianity, as the root cause of women's supposed oppression. Gloria Steinem herself said in 2014, "Religion is the biggest problem facing feminism today, but modern feminists realized that their need for a spiritual existence could be satisfied by a spiritualism that did not conflict with their feminist ideology the way traditional Christianity did. In fact, there was a religion that was not only compatible with modern radical feminism, but reinforced and revitalized it. There was a religion which grounded feminist beliefs in a rich history and tradition of female rebellion, one of the oldest religions in the world, which was revived by the occult New Age and the feminist ideology sweeping the West, witchcraft."